everybody. We are about to start, and I hope that while we talk, you enjoy your dinner and can multitask and do sort of eat and listen and participate at the same time. As was just said, this is probably one of the last panels of this amazing conference, so thank you to the organizers. Thank you, Raisina. And I am glad that the room is incredibly full, even this late in the day. And even more glad that we have an illustrious panel with us today that will tackle the challenging question of autonomous weapons, proxy wars, and sort of what the path forward in this space. We will dive right in with basically trying to set the scene in terms of what we're actually talking about. What are autonomous weapons? How do they differ from what has gone before? Do we actually have them in place already? What is the sort of path for the future for this? And then also move and have a conversation about the regulatory environment, both at domestic levels, looking at different countries and sort of how they have adopted policies in this space, and more importantly, and at the international level. The debate on laws at the United Nations will be something that we'll touch upon, which some of you might know under the Killer Robots campaign. So with that, I kind of want to just open the floor and have a little bit of an introduction. I will go just to my right to Lieutenant General Rajesh Pant, the National Cybersecurity Coordinator for India, to kick us off.
Thank you, Kaja. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You know, doctors say that while you're having dinner, you should discuss pleasant things, not swarm of drones and killer robots. So don't blame me if you have any digestion problems while we have this panel. Blame Samir Saran. But having said that, let's start talking about laws for laws. The LAWS is the Lethal Autonomous Weapon Systems. As you know, there are various definitions, but the common one is it's a weapon system that is partially or wholly without human intervention. Basically, there are three types where the human is in the loop, the human is on the loop, and the human is out of the loop. In the loop means the final decision when the weapon has to fire is made by the human being. On the loop means that the decision is taken by the system, but the human has the power of overriding that decision. And out of the loop is out of the loop. Everything is done, the processing, the firing, and this thing is done by the weapon system itself. So how real is the threat? It is as real as me sitting here. Basically, as you know, in warfare, the winner takes it all, right? There are no runners up in war. And technology has always been a factor which most advanced nations have been following and upgrading. It's part of modernization, actually. So we have to see it from that point of view. But having said that, there are many dangerous issues that come up, and one of them is something that is referred to as battlefield singularity, where the human mind cannot process the amount of data that is being fed to it, and finally the autonomous system takes over because of the lack of processing power. So most countries around the world, we find, are delving into this field of LAWS. We have two experts from the US who will be talking about how much of AI is being put into them. We've all heard about what China is doing. They have the PLA and the SSF, the Strategic Support Force. They've tested a number of unmanned systems which take off automatically. They do the surveillance and they land automatically. We have the UK, which recently announced a ghost fleet. They've promised about £4 million for that, and another £2.5 million for a drone program. And of course, we have some projects going on in India and Israel. And interestingly, these are the countries that are supporting the LAWS. Because there are a lot of discussions going on in the United Nations right from 2013. In fact, the deliberations started, and interestingly, India led the UNGG. There's a UN group of government experts on the LAWS. In the year 2017 and 18, we led it. a very fine Indian Foreign Service officer, Amandeep Singh Gill, was the chair of this. And they have agreed on 11 principles. And basically, two concepts they have agreed on, that the human should be part of the loop, the international humanitarian law should apply, as well as the Convention for Conventional Weapons. So basically, the laws of armed conflict, they say, have to apply for these sort of LAWS system also. The Indian stance has not been confirmed as yet, whether we are banning it or not banning it. We are open. We are seeing it as to which side the consensus is going, and that is when we'll be taking a decision. This year in June, there's another 10-day meet on the LAWS as part of the UNGG. I think I'll take a break there.
Thank you for that introduction. Maybe if I move over to Bill Parker, the president and CEO of the East-West Institute. He touched a little bit on the threats aspect. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much. First, as you look at it, this is really the third generation of weapons. First, you had gunpowder, then you had nuclear weapons, and now you have these autonomous weapons, and particularly these lethal autonomous weapons. It's interesting, though, if you take a step back of how you get to these weapon systems and a discussion of them, you first have to look at threats and how you define those threats of intent and capability. And so every country has threats. Every country has some sort of national security strategy, national military strategy, and national defense strategy. But then it gets more interesting as you start looking at national interests and vital national interests. Most would say that vital national interests are those where you're willing to send your sons and daughters into combat. And is that in case today when we're now looking at sending unmanned drones into combat, if you will. And so in many ways it changes the discussion about what is a vital national interest. Is it something else? So you start looking at that, and then you start looking from there at the application of instruments of national power. Diplomatic information, military, economic, financial intelligence, and law enforcement. And so what is that application? And from there, those phases of conflict, shape, deter, seize the initiative, dominate, stabilize, enable a civil authority. But once you get beyond that, now you have to define the battlefield. Is the battlefield still the battlefield of World War II, or is the battlefield now a refinery in Saudi Arabia, or is the battlefield an airfield in the Middle East, or is the battlefield a troop barracks somewhere in the middle of the United States? What is the battlefield now, and how is that defined? I think is a very interesting part as you start applying the laws of armed conflict. But at the end of the day, we still have to go back to the moral and ethical decisions that need to be made by the human in order to decide whether or not you're going to use these systems. And finally, I would say that these are discussions that many countries have been having for a long time. You only need to look at the Aegis weapons system that's used in the United States Navy and similar systems around the globe, where you take the man out of the loop, really, when you have a large group of aircraft, missiles, et cetera, coming inbound. And so now it is the system and not the human being that's deciding which weapon is used and which will be shot down, which target will be shot down first, whether those are manned or unmanned threats as they're coming in. So these discussions have been going on for a long time.
Thank you. Also, sort of, Rajesh just gave a really straightforward sort of definition of what we're talking about. So Giacomo from Unidir, if I turn to you, if the definitions are so simple, why has the conversation at the UN been so contentious?
That's a great question, thank you. So I think it's important to understand and to frame the discussion of laws within the UN system. Laws have been on the agenda basically since 2013 within the context of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. So within this framework, since 2013 and 2014 onwards, there have been a series of meetings, first informal and then turned into a group of governmental experts that was already referred to previously. Now, the issue of laws has proven to be quite divisive, and opinions have been quite polarized in this sense. And this is for a number of reasons, because the definition that has been used, the working definition, while being simple in terms of number of words, it touches on several concepts that can be interpreted in different ways. And when you have a process that is built on the basis of consensus, and then on one side, and on the other side, you have very polarized views on key terminology, key concepts like what does meaningful human control mean? What does human control mean? Are we talking about technologies that don't exist yet? Some countries, some member states are saying we are trying to regulate something that doesn't exist. Some others are saying that's not true. Autonomy has been used for decades. So when you have these polarized views, it becomes very difficult to advance quickly a debate that is built on consensus.
Thank you. Maybe if we go over to Lindsey Sheppard from Center for Strategic and International Studies. Lindsey, sort of listening to sort of what has just been said across the board, so do you think that these weapons exist? What should we be thinking about when it comes to whether it's incorporating AI? To be honest, like listening about definitions of battlefield, like should we be thinking about cybersecurity in this space? What from your perspective is actually happening?
So I think I will actually be provocative and start off by saying I very much disagree that the definitions are simple. Some of the greatest challenges we have in this field is delineating between overlapping but distinct concepts of artificial intelligence, autonomy, automation, autonomous weapons. And oftentimes we'll come to these conversations and folks will say, well, AI, and they mean that interchangeably with facial recognition or a drone system. And I think it's important to recognize the distinction between that so that we can have conversations that are grounded in, what is the actual technical capability. So it's important to remember that artificial intelligence is an umbrella term. Traditionally, it has been used to encompass a variety of computer science disciplines that implement some type of intelligent task function in machines. So when we talk about computer vision, is the process by which a computer can recognize images and recognize objects in images. Machine learning, which is the process by which a system can actually improve its performance over time with a variety of training data, an input data set, and now I can actually train it to improve its performance and get better over time. A lot of the anxiety around bringing in AI into autonomous weapons systems is really centered on the fact that when I combine that computer vision, so object recognition visually, with machine learning, it's very difficult to predict how the system will always behave. And so this is very different from Bill's example of the Aegis ship defense system, which one could say is autonomous, but it's rules-based. It has a very complex programming system that is fundamentally, you could boil it down to heuristics. If this condition, then this output or result. And the system is consistent. I can test it. I can put it through a very rigorous verification and validation regime. I can do test and evaluation. And I understand the conditions under which that system is valid. And that does not hold for machine learning systems. And that's where we're seeing a lot of anxiety of, is this technology, machine learning and computer vision, particularly when applied to, say, targeting and identification of targets and making that lethal a decision. The reality is the technology is just not mature enough. I can't say if it ever will be, but at the moment, for those folks that are in the conversations of designing these systems, the recognition is that you can't ensure that the system will behave and perform as intended with a certain level of confidence. And so I think that's really important because it fundamentally comes back to risk management. Understanding where the technology is appropriate, understanding, I think maybe more importantly, where it is not appropriate, and then making informed decisions about where to put this technology in our defense enterprise, in national security systems, or even in the civilian and commercial sector. And so I think it's interesting that we have these conversations about artificial intelligence, but fundamentally it comes back to human intelligence. The role of having educated decision makers that are literate in AI concepts, that understand, you don't have to be able to go program, but you should understand the basic concepts so that you can make intelligent and informed decisions about how to procure systems and where to put them. And so I think the greatest risk that I see looking out globally is the risk of a misunderstanding of the capability and mismanaged expectations that may actually lead us to put it in places where it is entirely not appropriate and it's not ready.
Thank you. And to conclude, I think this first round of discussion, I want to turn to Arvind Gupta, who is a last-minute addition to our panel from Digital India. Thank you so much. And sort of ask you to build a little bit on what Lindsey was just saying, and how do we make those ethical decisions around where, how we leverage, and if this technology.
Yeah, thank you. I think, let me start off by saying that I agree with how Lindsey puts it. The question mark on the technology. See, AI has been this holy grail that everybody thinks they are doing it. Everybody thinks everybody else is doing it, but really nobody knows who's doing what. And because it's like that holy grail, the terms have changed over the last 30 years. In my experience, during my research years as an academician and a researcher, I've just seen the terminology changing. The three-letter acronyms have changed over every 5 to 7 years, and they've become more, more in tune with what's happening. But what is the reality? Is the technology mature enough, or is there yet? But before I comment on that, there are a couple of things. What is the reality is that Moore's law has been broken, which basically means processing power is not doubling every 18 months, it's doubling probably every 8 to 9 months. So that's number one. Number two, from an industry perspective, the amount of data points we had 5 years ago, we probably have 100 times more data. Computer vision, or which uses a lot of sensors, or facial recognition, attributes, about a very diverse set of data across the world of people and how to recognize them, has increased a lot more. I mean, a very parallel example over a dinner conversation. There were 150, 200 million people who gave their face from today or 10 years down the road or 20 years down the road, some photographs how they were 10 years ago to a platform, and 200 data points were collected, how people would age. So if you have, you apply those data points to now these autonomous systems that you have let's say a known terrorist image 10 years ago, you know how they would age. So the point I'm trying to make is there is ampleness of data, there is huge processing power. That's where the maturity of technology has happened, definitely. But has the technology by itself evolved to a stage that we can have fully autonomous system who can make ethical decisions? And that's where I would say it's not anywhere close to being mature enough that it can be deployed at a level that we can say is fully autonomous. And we've had many incidents in the recent past where we've seen even a small autonomous vehicle failing. And we're talking about both offense and defense systems, where a large set of lives depend on it. So I think the maturity is not there of technology. Two, the guiding principles and the ethics are not defined. And I think, to me, that's the biggest concern. What Mr. Pant was talking about on humans in the loop, humans totally out of the loop. Let's say the situation really of the autonomous weapon is totally out of loop. That is really technically what's supposed to be. And that's where all the issues of ethics, of liability, of governance, of accountability, of verification will come into play. And I think those are very, very big issues. They've not been addressed yet. And unless they are addressed, I think that this technology will not mature.
Thank you for this. So, and maybe this is a question to everybody, and obviously, please jump in and have a conversation. But sort of almost building on what you were saying, to me, the question is, so do autonomous weapons and the principles and guidelines that need to be developed in this space, how do they differ from the principles that should be developed for just AI in general? Is there a massive difference? And you were mentioning, machines making ethical decisions. Do we expect them to make ethical decisions, or do we expect them to be developed with ethics in mind?
So let me tell you, as an ex-military man, that as of now, no commander would like a fully autonomous weapon. We don't want robots to replace us, firstly. So this has been our stand consistently, that it should not violate the international humanitarian laws. And even in IHL, there are two clauses. There's a clause of proportionality, and there's a clause of distinction. So it should be able to distinguish between the combatants and the non-combatants. And the proportionality implies that the damage to civilians should be proportional to the military operation. So that is one of the things that we are insisting on. And the second is that there has to be human control as far as the weapon is concerned. I remember a couple of years back, there was a Undersecretary of State from the US who had visited us in the Ministry of Defense. And he made a statement that the last fighter pilot of the US Air Force has been born. I still remember his statement. And so there is going to be a change in the future. We all can foresee it. But as of now, and Arvind mentioned about the ethics, I would go along with the UNGGE, which is already in place. And as I said, they are having these meetings on an annual basis. There's some consensus on the basic principles which has already been reached. So I think we should go as per the consensus approach.
I look at it from a little bit different perspective, in that if you believe that conflict prevention and saving lives is a noble cause, then leaders really better understand the unintended consequences of deploying these systems before they're ready to be deployed. I think that's a very important point, and some of my colleagues brought that up earlier here, but we have to understand these systems before they're deployed, or you're going to end up with unintended consequences, not only on the battlefield, but potentially in rural areas and in our major cities.
May I? Sure. Just a quick word on ethics. I think ethics is certainly one of the famous polarizing issues that I was referring to earlier. And you can see two different approaches to ethics, if I'm trying to hopefully not oversimplify. There is the ethics by design approach, or there is the whole question about ethical use. So coming from a previous life with a uniform on, military forces are very good at setting operational requirements that can then be translated into technical requirements for a new capability to be developed. When it comes to ethics, if you want ethics to be included by design in the technology you're developing, you need to be able to generate some sort of ethical requirements, and that's probably a step too far from even going back to the understanding of the technology. If you want to try to codify ethical requirements, you need to be able to fully understand what the technology is about. Hence the pivoting more on the issue of ethical use, in which then the question becomes, how do we ensure that the decisions that the machine makes on behalf of the human are somehow bounded within parameters that ensure that non-ethical actions are taken.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting space to be in, because a lot of these conversations that we're having mirror conversations that are also having in the commercial sector. And there is no consensus in the private sector and the commercial sector on questions of liability, who's responsible if a system fails. You can look in the United States, in California and in Arizona, and I believe a couple other states that are kind of the test beds for autonomous vehicles. There are massive unanswered questions over who is responsible when these vehicles fail. Is it the car manufacturer? Is it I guess it's not a driver anymore, but a person sitting in the car. And so there's really challenges over thinking about these questions of liability, unanswered questions of how do you have ethical, unbiased data sets. So if I am training a system that either does facial recognition or, for example, decides who sees what job openings are on LinkedIn, or screens resumes from a private corporation, the representation in that input data does impact the output data. And we are still seeing these conversations in the private sector about how do we have unbiased from a social standpoint, not from a data science standpoint, how do we have unbiased data, representative data? And so these are questions that we're grappling with in defense, but as was pointed out, defense actually places a even higher standard for use. Because use in national security and use in the defense context must abide by international law of war. It must be militarily it must be necessity. It must have proportionality. It must be able to distinguish. And so a lot of these things that we are still grappling with at a very early stage relatively in the private sector are questions that will remain unanswered for defense, but then actually add on higher standards for the use in defense.
Yeah, I just want to add, I think it's an interesting dilemma, I think, because while we say ethics by design, and that should be built in, still the building of that is done by, number one, by data that may be biased, as Lindsey points out, by people that may be biased. So the systems are built by humans that could be biased, and that would be resulting that bias reflects on these autonomous systems eventually. And just to give you an example, you talked about commercial, autonomous vehicles, autonomous trucks, whatever it may be. Who are they owned by? I mean, if there is a situation where, God forsaken, a car has to decide between saving the passengers versus hurting a family on the road, how does it decide that? And what is the decision? Who makes the decision? Now apply that higher standard to a weapon system, and high value target, 5 high value target versus a family, and how does a weapon system decide whether to neutralize that high value target or not, versus the cost of the civilian casualties in that. So I think it's a very big both research question and a design question, but unless these issues are sorted, I don't think so we'll have a conclusive answer to this.
Thank you. So I feel like some of these questions are not sorted for human decision making, but I think the other thing that I found interesting from this conversation as well was it seems that on one occasion the UN, that means, is ahead of its time. The discussions have been going on for a long time now, as we've discussed, and fine, there's not been like complete resolution, but there's been progress around certain issues. Potentially ahead of these systems being deployed. So that should be a very positive thing. But somehow there's still a perception that, the negotiation, the discussions at the UN are slow, protracted, not going anywhere. So is this true? Or, do we need to do more? Do we need to have a ban before these weapons are deployed as the technology develops at the same time? What is the path forward at the governance level?
May I start? See, I just want to emphasize again, as per the laws of armed conflict, 9 categories of weapons are already banned, right? They include poisonous gases, expanding ordnance, incendiary weapons, blinding laser, cluster bombs, etc. So I'm again insisting that it is the autonomous weapons, where the human is out of the loop, that is what should come in this category, right? That is the important part, because the progression is inevitable. You cannot stop technology heading that way. So all the more reason that it needs to be regulated at the earliest. That is what I want to say.
I guess one of the questions to ask is, how far do you take this? How far do you take the human out of the loop? If you had lethal autonomous weapons in 1962, would it have been taken out of the hands of Kennedy and you would have had a strike in Cuba? If you would have taken that out of the decision of Nikita Khrushchev, would he have continued and crossed over the blockade? If you move that to current times, does a U.S. Navy ship decide to fire on a swarm of small Iranian boats that are moving towards it, or do you have that gut feeling that even though they're inside a certain kill parameter, you decide not to shoot? So at some point, you have to ask yourself, how many if-then-else statements can you build in to the point where this system is learning to the point where it can have that gut reaction that is correct based on what it has learned like a human?
I want to go to back to the point that you were making in the question around the role of the UN. And I think that it is important that despite the fact that there is a mounting degree of frustration around how slowly this negotiation, these debates are progressing, I think that there is a value added in remaining within the UN context. Some parties and people or civil society has been proposing or putting on the table the idea of taking this discussion outside of the UN, bringing as an example the Ottawa Convention, for example, for the mine ban treaty. Now, if you look merely at the number of signatories, you can say, well, that route could potentially unlock if you want, the situation and make, find consensus among states that all think that this is bad. However, if you go back and look at the Ottawa Convention, you see that among the 164 signatories, 3 key states are missing: the U.S., Russia, and China. So there is a risk of taking this discussion outside of the UN, because if on one side you can advance it, on the other side you might lose, key states. They're actually the states that are leading technology development. So the question would be, how much value would something that is widely accepted but doesn't have, doesn't count on key states have outside of the UN? I think this is quite an important thing to consider.
I think the question of where do we go on governance, one area would be to recognize that there is something unique about this technology. So as with prior control regimes, they tend to be typically very hardware-based. I can prevent the flow of a piece of sensitive technology from going from country A to country B. I can just not give my notebook to Giacomo, and that's fine. And I can create enforcement mechanisms and verification measures that make sure that, I did not give my notebook to Giacomo by the end of the night. One of the challenges with autonomous weapons and with AI and machine learning is it is incredibly software dependent. And the ability to verify that something is a rules-based system that we are pretty fine with versus something that may be an irresponsible application of machine learning is actually quite difficult to prove from the outside. That would require some type of verification body to be in the software for the system. And the reality is that defense enterprises are not going to open up their systems like that. That is sensitive technology. So I think one area where we can really start thinking about how do we lead in this space is thinking about certification measures, establishing processes and standards for certifying machine learning systems, verification and validation techniques that allow me to certify that if I buy a machine learning system from Bill, that I can certify he's done his due diligence and that this system will continue to perform as expected. And right now, I mean, those sound like easy things, but the verification of a third-party machine learning system is actually quite difficult and is a significant technical hurdle. And I think the question of do we ban, how do we govern, again, it really highlights the necessity of the role of the human and being able to understand these systems and where they are appropriate and where they're not. And I think through educating more people to the actual technology itself can effectively work to prevent the kind of just wide open, I'm going to put this technology wherever it is. If you truly understand the capability, the conversations don't take you to putting it somewhere irresponsible.
Yeah, I think this is a very, very important point of verification standards and both internal and multilateral. I think by definition, AI systems which update themselves, learn self-learning mechanisms, self-learning algorithms, the biggest challenge, both commercially in the commercial world and in the defense world, is standardization and verification. And there is, I mean, we are still struggling with standardizing and verifying certain commercially open available systems, so let alone doing it for defense systems. So I think this will be the biggest challenge when we go about discussing, and until we have that, again, a discussion and some sort of a framework, a rules framework for that, the maturity of the systems to be deployed and actual warfare will not happen.
Thank you. I feel, Mr. Rajesh, you have a question? No, open up? Yeah. So I have a question, and then we will open it up to participants from the audience. So if you have questions, I feel there is roaming mics around. So, get ready, raise your hands. My question is, building on some of the things you said, do you, and sort of looking at my own experience, do you see the ICT industry participating in some of these discussions? Because these are the issues the tech industry have been grappling with, whether it's on cloud computing, whether it's on AI, and some of them have standards and solutions, but do they participate in the laws debate? How not just the traditional weapons manufacturers, but do you see the tech industry?
Yeah, I think the tech industry, from my perspective, is very cognizant, and they're participating in whatever discussions they're brought in. The larger issue is that, I mean, whether it's defense or commercial, I think it's very important to get the right people who understand the implications of this technology, both in the conversation, in the design, in setting rules and standards, setting international treaties and agreements. All of that should be done, because otherwise most of them will not be executionable and implementable. But the tech industry is involved in it. I'll give you a small example. There was a big geek conference, and I call it geek because it was really geeky, and the real AI was being discussed there. And one of the big sandboxes we ran was run by the tech industry, the tech community, was on, how do you do verification, for example. A typical autonomous system, forget weapons or anything else, can have more than 100 and 120 different contributors of code coming into it. And each of these pieces of code updates themselves. And to keep the system in to maintain system integrity and make sure the verification happens, and then the backward accountability also happens, the tech industry in that sandbox put together a blockchain-based solution. Just an example. So I think it's very, very important that the tech industry participates, and it's a very valid point. Coming from the industry, I can tell you this is somewhere that we miss out. Many of these conversations don't have the right participations from the community that's probably going to develop this. So it's a very important point. We need to have this conversation along with the tech people, the tech community who's going to eventually, develop it.
I agree, and I think you actually raise a very important point that is probably very poignant for this audience, is that one of the unique aspects of this technology is that so much of the capability has actually been driven by the tech sector, by that private industry.
Absolutely.
But the interesting thing is that they're going to focus where there is a good return on investment, typically where the consequences for failure are low. This is why we have seen machine learning really take off in the advertising world. The cost of failure if I have my Gmail and an email goes through my spam filter that wasn't supposed to is quite low compared to, say, a fatal consequence in making a wrong choice. So you've really highlighted an area where we actually have a need for national level leadership and for international leadership, because this is an area where commercial is not going to be incentivized to focus and to really drive the conversation forward. So these standard setting bodies, government level activities, international bodies are able to take on these tasks that are relatively low return on investment and have a high payoff though in the long run. And so I think that's important to recognize that everybody has to be in the arena and in the discussion.
Yeah, I think that the UN is slowly but surely realizing that multi-stakeholder approach, which does include industry, is the way forward. Within the laws debate, the way that the laws debate has been structured so far with a group of governmental experts, it's up to member states to bring within their delegation experts from industry or from the tech sector. And there have been instances, but there isn't a formal mechanism for the kind of the technical community as a whole to be brought into the discussion. Also because I think, and this is a broader question around multi-stakeholder engagement, multi-stakeholder is a buzzword that sounds great, but then when you try to unpack it, what do you do with it? You bring in industry, and industry provides useful input. What do you do with it? Is it just informative? Do they have a role to play in decision making? Probably not. But at what level does the multi-stakeholder engagement take you? But certainly, governments and member states that are actively engaging in these negotiations could benefit from broader engagement with the industrial sector.
Thank you. So maybe are there questions from the audience? I feel there's a lady that's waving at the back. So if there's someone with a mic that could go up to her. Are there others? If you're there, please wave. So if you stand up, because I think he can't see you. So right at the back.
Very last table.
And if you can introduce yourself when you ask the question.
Yes, hi, thank you so much. My name is Clara Bulov. I work with the ICRC. And my question relates to, because you spoke at length about the dangers of machine learning and what that might mean in combat. But at the same time, we also know that human decision-making in situations of combat is far from perfect, right? So I wondered whether there isn't also an opportunity in that, and machines may make better and more sort of level-headed choices, if you will, than humans. And also, post-fact, it might be more traceable when there was a bias, as opposed to a human making a decision on the basis of a bias that might be much harder later to realize. Thank you.
Thank you. That is an excellent provocative question. I think sort of similar to that angle is, the machines could act with more proportionality and more distinction in some cases. So how do we answer that?
I mean, I think in the immediate term, and I guess it's kind of fuzzy of depending on how wide do you want to scope that chain of decision making, and where are we thinking about putting machine learning? I think one of the biggest benefits to actually enabling, better decision making in conflict situations is the ability of machine learning to help human analysts tackle large volumes of data that they would not otherwise be able to tackle, and to support them in executing repetitive tasking. And if I can use a machine to offload that repetitive work and help them understand the information space better, to find the weak signals in the entirety of the data noise, perhaps that actually allows them to do the things about combat that are uniquely human, to do that better. So they're not wasting their time sifting through cables or sifting through information or filling out forms. But if I can use machine learning or some type of robotic process automation to offload that workflow and allow them to do that uniquely human thing better, I think the farther you move down the kill chain, if that's what we want to call it, the closer you get to that lethal decision, the less mature the technology is. And I don't see that as an immediate application or one to really kind of focus on, is that going to be here tomorrow or 2 years in the future? But I think the farther you get away from that immediate lethal decision to supporting functions, to back office functions, there is actually a huge benefit in using machine learning to allow that productivity increase.
For necessity, governments and militaries find lots of ways to kill our fellow man. But imagine if you took that technology and it actually worked. We get it to the point where it's actually working. You can use that same technology where the threat is no longer your fellow man, but cancer or some other disease out there. I think there's a real positive that can come out of this too. You look at NASA and Velcro and Ziploc bags, et cetera. Similarly, I think you can use this process to come up with the good side of it too, and the medical world seems to be a perfect fit for that.
Yeah, if I can just add to that conversation, and to the lady who asked the question, it's actually very pertinent. The speed, as I explained, of decision making of a computer cannot be matched today, and this amount of data sets and sensors available to give it the right inputs, both commercially and in the defense world, cannot be matched. So with that perspective, I think, and a machine learning, an autonomous system will always make faster and faster decisions. Whether they will make better decisions, I'm not sure, but faster is definitely, and that is a key distinction. They will definitely make faster decisions, and depending on how the algorithms are set up, the decision making will improve, will become better over time. But so if your question is the element of human error, now just imagine that in an autonomous system, the same element of human error or biases getting multiplied thousands and thousands of times, because once an autonomous system really takes over, there is no turning it back.
Thank you for this. Are there other questions in the room? The room is very large, so if you could stand up if you have a question. Oh, go ahead.
Good evening. My name is Rajan Luthra. I work in Reliance Industries. The question I have for the panel is really about the potential solutions from such kind of systems once they get deployed. We have seen what happened in Saudi Aramco on 14 September. How are the counter-drone solutions panning out, and what is the kind of success rate that they are achieving now and in the next 12 months?
See, Rajan, The semi-autonomous weapons are already on the ground, right? When I say semi-autonomous, I mean that in your case, let's say the radar detection, tracking, and firing of the weapon is already being done. So the radar picks it up, it recognizes that it's a hostile aircraft, possibly even the type of aircraft, and then initiates the firing, and then the process is taken off. The issue in question is fully autonomous. That is where the dangers are lying, right? So because of all the aspects that we've discussed, the verification of software being made by third parties, etc., that is where the dangers are lie. But semi-autonomous weapons are already in place.
Thank you for that. Are there other questions? While people think that, I can see a hand up there, but while people think, so what would happen if an autonomous weapon, fully autonomous weapon, was deployed? Do you think even with the laws, given that human intervention takes time, would that be a fast path to everybody sort of adopting this type of technology once there is one in the field?
I'm sure the excuse me, the research I'm sure is already going on in autonomous systems, because as I said, it is the edge you have in the battlefield that makes you the winner. And this will be a highly close guarded secret. It will be something like the quantum computing, which is happening these days, and although we are hearing about it, but nobody is really coming out with what is the capability on ground. So this is at present, it's like a national treasure sort of a secret, but I'm quite sure that in the defense research and development and the other laboratories that are making defense systems, this work is going on.
Yeah, I think that this kind of capability is, the technological barriers to developing, acquiring, and fielding these kind of capabilities are quite high. So going back to something that was mentioned earlier, to me, one of the risks is that this kind of capabilities being deployed too early, maybe to respond to the famous kind of first mover advantage. Country X fields the capability for the first time, shows that it's successful, and that initiates a kind of a race to keep up that could lead potentially to irresponsible deployment of technology before it's ready. And we've heard why and what are all of those parameters and factors that could influence that irresponsible decision.
Yeah, I want to just add to that on a lighter side, that I think people who actually are states or nations which actually have the semi-autonomous or fully or will develop the fully autonomous system slowly will take their time to disclose what they have, and states which actually don't may start claiming, because it's the most difficult thing to verify whether you have it or not. So I think it is an interesting thing we'll see in the years to come. And like very much in AI, a lot of this is PowerPoint today. In other autonomous systems, you'll also have, in double quotes, a lot of unverified claims.
So the question at the end of the room.
Can I speak?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Ashok from JNU New Delhi. I'm actually visually challenged, so I'll be asking an ethical part of this discussion that you guys are talking about. So basically, when you have autonomous systems and artificial intelligence involved in it, so you do have sort of self-working sort of systems, which could definitely help those people who are deprived of some sort of skills or abilities or senses. So when you have ethical part being taken into account and restrict sort of autonomousness of the devices or your vehicles or whatsoever, it so happens that like those who need it at the most, somewhere getting deprived of such systems, which is really helpful. I'll be happy if somebody could comment on this particular part. Thank you.
I mean, I think you raise an interesting, I mean, it's a very good point, and it's one that I assume all of us on this panel have encountered, is that oftentimes the debate on particularly AI tends to focus on this one kind of niche or more narrow application that could be very problematic, while we don't necessarily spend enough time thinking about how can we leverage this technology and leverage these capabilities in ways for good. And I do think there are a significant number of research efforts and companies that do look at how do we take this technology, how do we make more capable machines so that we can apply them in novel ways to actually support humanity and do better, beyond just giving you better targeted ads.
And maybe I will abuse my position as moderator to help answer that question. I do, just from a Microsoft perspective, we do invest a large amount in developing accessible technologies. Whether it's the feature in PowerPoint that now exists where you sort of speak and automatically you get subtitles. That works pretty well. That is helpful for people who are hearing impaired, or there is also a device that has been developed in partnerships with, I think, a nonprofit in the accessibility community that helps describe the world to blind people, so visually impaired people, as they walk, so you can hear sort of what's basically going on. There are a lot of, and Microsoft's not alone, but there are a lot of investments plans that are going in this space. I think you're right, AI is not just the military, and it's also not just life and death decisions, but are as wonderful things as helping other humans, and as banal things, I would say, as like you said earlier, trying to make sense of the massive amounts of data out there, whether it's to protect defense systems, to help understand and analyze data all up, predict weather. There's many applications. It's just, I think, for the purpose of this panel, ours is more of a military aspect. Thank you for that question. Is there one last question? Because we have 2 minutes left. Otherwise, I will turn, go ahead.
I'm Air Vice Marshal Michael Fernandez, retired from the Indian Air Force. I have a couple of questions. One is to General, not couple of questions, just one to General Pant. Since 1983, when the Boeing was, when the transport aircraft was shot down over Sakhalin, to what is happening very currently, we find that having a human in the loop has not benefited us very much, and it's as prone to mistakes as anything else. What I was hoping to hear from this panel was how laws would be misused or would be used in proxy wars. What we have heard just now are things that would be followed by states and established entities. What if these are used by proxy wars, and how would that change? Because most of these technologies are ubiquitous, they are easy to obtain, they are cheap, and they could be easily available to anybody. So how do you look at this being used, misused, or whatever word you all would want to use, as far as proxy wars are concerned, where traceability is not available, cost is hardly anything, and the availability is rather easy?
Yeah, thank you, Marshal Fernandez. Why autonomous systems? You're speaking to somebody who handles cyber security for the nation, and the same thing worries me day and night, that without attribution, how do you try and trace the culprits? And it is being done by individuals, it is being done by mafia organizations, and it is being done at the nation state level. So this is a real threat, what you said about proxy wars and small groups and getting these cheap weapons. And for those who have not surfed the dark web, it is a nightmare. When you go to the dark web and see all the things that are being sold there, right from weapons to drugs and state secrets and credit debit cards. This is a huge problem. So this is all the more reason that we have to cooperate internationally and come to some consensus. I'll give you an example. Recently we had a heist bank fraud case where the money was taken out from 28 different countries within a period of 2 hours. This happened in Cosmos Bank in Pune. So 28 different countries, the people were there. So this is how the mafia is organized, and in every forum I say this, that this cannot be fought by one country alone, which is why the importance of the United Nations is there, which is why the importance of regional forums is there. So for proxy wars and for all these asymmetric weapons that we're talking of, we have to come together, and that is where unfortunately the problem is there. You are aware that the internet is being called as the splinter net today. There's a balkanization of the internet taking place. Russia and China are going one way, Europe and USA are going in. So that's a different discussion. But that's a real threat, what you're saying. The misuse and in proxy war. Anyone else?
Yeah, if you look at the comparison between nuclear weapons and biological weapons, this is kind of comes up the same discussion again. On the nuclear side, you have to have fissile materials. You have to have not only the technology, but the fissile material to go along with it. But when you're talking about biological, really what you need is somebody who's super smart, that understands how to employ what's already out there in nature. And so it's the great equalizer in many ways. And so when you talk about this technology, once the technology is out there and the cat's out of the bag, I believe this is going to be another one of those great equalizers that could be used exactly like you're talking about by maybe those nefarious groups that you don't want it to be used by.
Thank you for that. I kind of want us to end on a slightly more positive note. So I will ask if all of you could provide maybe a couple of minute, 20 seconds of closing remarks, just to sort of summarize what you'd like the audience to take away, so we don't end on the gloom and doom note. Go ahead.
I can start. I think my closing remarks would be that AI, in whatever shape and form we define it today, is coming of age. It's not there yet. The maturity is not there. But definitely with the availability of amount of data sets that we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years, the computing power makes it more viable than ever before. One. Two, the real problem is combining the rules, the principles, the accountability and governance along with the technology. And unless that is done, the true autonomous systems will not be viable.
I feel like most of my remarks are depressing, so I'm going to do my best to make this happy. I think it is an excellent point that trends in the democratization of software, the lower barriers to entry to highly capable technologies in proxy wars for non-state actors in the cybersecurity or in the cyber domain in general, it decreases the distance to capability. It allows people to punch above their weight and to have a greater impact. So that's bad if you're looking at, how do I deal with a hyper-enabled threat actor? But on the flip side, we are seeing this really fascinating trend of new entrants into the defense and innovation sphere. I have colleagues at home in the United States that do hypersonic testing, and it's 5 of them, and they run their company out of essentially their garage. And they're providing repeatable and cheap access to hypersonic flight test conditions, because they can do 3D printing and additive manufacturing and build their flight vehicle. And they do have PhDs in aerospace engineering, so there's a little bit of a barrier to entry. But it's really fascinating the level of technology that is now available to more people. And I think we're seeing a lot of really exciting innovation across the board. From places that have traditionally not been innovation hubs. And so I think that's really exciting to see what these new players and new actors and new entrants can bring to us, hopefully for good, as our colleague in the back of the room mentioned.
I guess my concluding remarks would be trust the system at the multilateral level. Don't let the frustration emerging from slow progress kind of obfuscate the value that the UN can bring as a framework for these kind of discussions. We are in an era where security is globalized, and the UN is the platform and the framework within which these sort of topics can be negotiated. It's going to take time, but the UN has delivered in the past, and it will deliver again. We just need to be patient and understand that the UN and multilateral diplomacy can really help in this field.
I think conflict's going to continue. You have almost 80 million refugees around the globe right now, and that number continues to grow. That's not good news, and you want to end on a good note. So my good note is that I believe that if you look at organizations like the United Nations, look at the number of people that were in abject poverty just a few decades ago, and look at how many are now. If they could do it with that, they can work this process as well to come up with the right answer.
Yeah, I'll just take off from very left that there is an existing framework of CCW, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. While India has not taken a formal position on banning or not banning laws, but we totally endorse the consensus on two aspects. One is that these weapons must comply to the international humanitarian laws, and the other is there has to be human control. These two aspects we are absolutely clear on.
Thank you so much for participating in this panel and in this, I think, wide-ranging discussion. I think we covered quite a lot of different aspects of AI, lethal autonomous weapons, and technology in general. So thank you so much. Thank you, the audience, for listening. And I think we are almost at the end of the conference all up. I think maybe there's like one more nightcap session or so. So thank you for having patience with us, and thank you for the organizers again for this fantastic conference.